Welcome to the Learning Reinvented Podcast, brought to you by myself, Katie Godden, and the team from The Learning Effect. There are lots of learning podcasts out there, so we wanted to do something slightly different. In this episode, we'll be exploring the do's and don'ts when you become the leader of an organization's learning function. To share his knowledge, expertise, and experience, I'm joined by my co-founder of The Learning Effects, James Poletyllo. James, regular listeners of the podcast will have heard you interviewing guests before, but do you want to tell our listeners about you and your background?
Thanks, Katie. My background before the last 3 or 4 years where we've been running the Learning Effect was I worked in-house in lots of different roles, predominantly learning focused, but also covering things such as HR, recruitment, organisational design and development. And that was across a series of different businesses and different sectors. And quite a lot, if I look back at the commonality of my roles, was around startup of functions or the turnaround of functions that weren't really working for the business as they should have done.
Also, given your background, what have you learned about how to go into a new role heading up a learning team?
I think it's an interesting question, because if you followed what a lot of the stuff in the books would tell you, you'll go out there and read the first 90 days, which is sort of a Bible as to how to approach any role and be successful, get in there, quick wins, etc., etc. I think what I've learned in roles is there's some really important things that you need to get right. And probably the first one is to think about what you're going into and what that role is, what the business is, what the learning function is. Because I've walked into roles where I have literally been the first person in learning. So one of my first startup roles, I was going in to start up a function. I was the sole person there, and all they had was a load of training folders on a folder. I've been into other businesses where they've had an established training function with large teams. I've been into other businesses where there were training functions, but I was starting a new part of a training function. So I think there's no one type of training function is probably the starting point. So I think it's about understanding what you're walking into. And that can be one or two things. You might be already in a business and stepping up into leading a function you're part of, or into a business you already know, or you might be coming in completely new. So I think the first thing I would say, it's all about trying to understand what you're walking into. And probably aligned to that is what you're told, don't necessarily take at complete face value, because what you're told coming into a business is not necessarily what you will find when you walk in there. So what I've always found is go into the business, use your initial briefing as a starting point, but from there, that's really where your journey begins of discovery. And discovery is really, really important.
Can you expand a little bit more about that discovery phase that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think what you'll have going into a business, you might have a set induction already established for you. It might be that you can help shape that induction. You might have, as I had in one business, that there was just absolutely nothing and I had to work it out myself. But you're walking into a business to try and understand exactly where you are and establish what you're doing. So as part of that, you will need to do various different things. You will need to get out there and meet the business, so to speak. So meet your stakeholders, whoever that happens to be, the person you're reporting into, leaders of functions, operational colleagues you might be supporting. There might be a learning team you're working in. So you're going to have to get out and meet those stakeholders. You're also going to have to understand what's there already. So what's the current expectation for learning? And you'll find that in lots of ways. So there might be a training offer already, there might be learning systems in place, there might be courses being offered, there might be HR processes and practices, or there might not. So I think it's about going in and really just understanding and being curious, asking lots and lots of questions about what's there, and getting people to show you stuff. So asking people to talk you through systems, talk you through courses, trying to establish as much of the background of something as you possibly can. And one of the things I've always found is don't go in and talk learning, because if you go in and talk learning, you'll get learning as a response. Go in and be curious about the business you're working in. Be curious about what people's challenges are, what their problems are. And you'll very quickly establish during those conversations what people think about learning, because they might ask you to, tell you about your role. So you're going to have to give some context. But if you walk into conversations with stakeholders and they start giving you a list of, here are the courses, or here's my training requirements, or this is what I expect from you, you very much get a pitch as to what the expectation is currently in the business, or maybe what that particular stakeholder's expectations of learning are. And if you are in those conversations and you're finding people are just coming back to a tick list of training, or here's an output, and you're not really seen as a partner or a business partner in the business, you know that you've got some work to do on that pitch. And it might be that's one individual's perception, or that might be the wider perception across the business. So I would always talk those things, but I've always seen myself first as a business person. So I want to go in there and understand your business. And one of the questions I think you should be able to answer as a business person is, how does your business make money? How, what are your goals and objectives? And that might be very different. So in a commercial business, it'll be, how do you make money, or how are you profitable, or what are your business objectives, and really understanding what those are at a macro level for the whole organization. It might be in other businesses, it's not a commercial type business. It might be charitable sector, it might be public sector, etc. So you might have different objectives for your business. But I always find it quite astounding that, people don't always understand how their business makes money. So you might be in a hospitality business, but ultimately the value for the business might sit in the bricks and mortar properties you hold. You might be making money not necessarily through the sales you make, but through kickbacks, through the procurement processes, because you're buying so many goods from suppliers. So I think really having a good commercial understanding of the business helps you to set and understand where you can impact upon the commerciality of the business. And also, when you're speaking to functions, you can start to think about where they fit into the overall picture. And one thing I would say is, don't always make an assumption as well, because it might be that you walk into a business and you're from banking and you've walked into another banking business, or you're from retail and you've walked into another retail business. And I've predominantly moved sector, so I've not stayed in the same sector. But where I've seen challenges is where sometimes you walk into a business and you assume that you know the business because you've already been in retail. So, I was last officially in retail back in 2001. I would not claim to know any retail business when I walk in, but I've worked around lots of retail organizations since. And I would always be curious to understand each of those businesses in their own entity, not walk in there with assumptions that I know something about them already.
Thanks, James. They sound like really good tips, and I think it kind of keeps aligned to what we do in our business as well. Some things in there are very similar. So you kind of said like what you should be doing when you're heading into a new role. What things do you think you should avoid?
I think I probably started to touch on one of them there, which is the making assumptions and thinking you know everything about a business. And Katie, you'll know we worked with a business that made money from selling fizzy liquids that people would drink. And that business had a particular setup and culture. Now, having also worked alongside a competitor organization in that industry that also from the outside might be in the same type of business, the organizational structures of those businesses, the way they work, the cultures are so different that you cannot just lift and assume that you already know those businesses going from A to B. It's the same in any business I've moved across, that from the outside they might look similar, but once you get into those businesses you can realize that the structures are very, very different. So one of the first things I would do is assume that you're going with a set knowledge. I would always almost believe you're going in knowing nothing, because sometimes having knowledge or thinking you have knowledge of something can be really dangerous. The other thing is there's always a sort of desire to make an impact and to do something, and you'll hear about, quick wins and do things that you're going to do in your business. But there's a balance to that as well, because you set a precedent for yourself and you set a tone and a way of working by those first things you agree to and the first things you start to do. So I think it's also thinking about the implications of those quick wins you decide to put into a business. Again, sometimes we've seen it where we've had to go in and pick up a mess in a business where someone has just gone in and said, maybe I'll put in the course or the learning system I've used elsewhere because I know it, I can do it quickly, I can get something in, but they haven't done the discovery piece sufficiently to understand what the real requirements of that business is. So they've put in something that's comfortable, or again, you've gone through a recruitment process and people have asked you, what have you done before? And you might be walking in with people going, hey, I'd love you to do that equality and diversity program you did before. I'd love you to put in that leadership development program you did before. But you've got to understand that you're walking into a different context, and your skills got to be in unpicking and maybe redefining how you did those things. And one of the things that always worries me, and I've seen it from so many people in their careers, is they roll into a new job and a few months into that job, they start pulling out either the stick with all of their courses or presentations from a previous job, or back in the day it used to be people had hard printed copies of everything they've ever done or folders, and people start to put those things in because that's what they've done before, and it's almost like a copy and paste from one business to another. And I think if you're going into a new business, it's an opportunity to do something new and to reinvent yourself. And what always I find surprising is that people have to copy and paste because they don't understand what they've done well enough to do it from scratch, from first principles. And I've also seen people take stuff from a previous organization they weren't involved in and just move that across. And they don't really have the understanding of it because they haven't built from the ground up. And I'd use the analogy of, you sat on the bus, you were maybe in the second row and watch what was going, but you haven't driven that bus, you haven't led that project. So I think it's about knowing what your skills are and what your curiosity should lead to, and then understanding all the solutions you can bring in. And you may use the same solutions again, but I guarantee they will be applied slightly differently. And it's also trying to tap into your wider level of support as well. So how can people support you in that journey? I think one big hole I've fallen into before is you're going in somewhere and there is a reason it's in the place it is. And I've always gone in there and tried to be very respectful of what's come before, because I've had people come into my businesses and say, oh my God, this is such a mess. And it can immediately put you on the defensive, and you don't want to turn around and say, well, you should have seen it 6 months ago. It was absolute chaos. What you want to do is be able to explain the story and explain the journey you're on. And so I think if you're going into a business, you need to take that time to be curious and not jump and make assumptions or write people off, because it can be that people in your team or people in your business are operating within the confines of what they've been allowed to. I think another point around that is sometimes people won't tell you all the stuff you need to know. So you'll be told various different things. There might be relationships, there might be history. But again, something I have come up against is in a business where you don't find out for months or years that actually something that you've now dismantled for very good reasons was someone else's pet project, or had been signed off or agreed by someone else. And I think you've got to be curious and try and find out why things have happened, but be aware you're going into an organizational context, particularly large or complex organizations where there is a lot going on, and you're not going to find all of those things out overnight. So, try to be fact-based, evidence-based, not judgmental, be very clear on your communication, and try to bring people with you. And don't make it about you. You've got to build allies in any business. So if you're going in and you're the only person in a business function, so you're the first person setting up a learning function, the first thing I had to do was try and create a set of people in the other departments who wanted me to work with them. And that was by talking business problems, not by talking learning. So I was helping them achieve their objectives. Whether they understood what we were doing was learning and HR didn't really matter. And again, in bigger businesses, it's about going in and understanding where the function is, taking people with you. You're not going to take everyone with you, but doing that in a way that you can take people with you. You can be transparent. You can foster differences of opinion and constructive conversations.
Thanks very much, James. I think they're really good tips for people that are starting a new role. So now you've got your kind of do's and don'ts of starting a new role. How do you measure your success in it?
I think again, it's setting those objectives for yourself. So sitting back and thinking, what's your plan? So at some point in your new role, you're going to have a plan as to what you want to achieve, whether that's changes you want to make in the function, things you want to establish, ways of working or ways of thinking or practices you need to establish. You might have some hard and fast goals, right? I've got to help with this business project and we've got to have this rolled out by then, or I've got to implement or do something, and those are functional, measurable things. It might be you've aligned yourself to a business metric, so you're going to help influence customer service or sales, or you're going to have an element of retention, or whatever the wider goals are. And it can be some really bizarre but softer things. So it might be a measure of success for you is the first time that someone doesn't come to you with a list of training courses to do, but actually comes and talks to you about a business problem. So I think to me, it's about taking a holistic view as to what success looks like. And you've got to balance that moving to action and starting to do things, as well as forming relationships, as well as forming ways of working, setting out longer term goals and vision. So I would sit down and map out the plan in my head as to what I want to achieve and what's important in that business. And then I would have a variety of things I want to see along the way, and I'll be asking myself, again, some of those questions you might do when you're doing something like SMART objectives, but how am I going to know I've got there? What are the milestones along the way on my journey, and start to measure those in, and then constantly seeking feedback, seeking views on what you're doing, testing, learning and iterating what you're doing, and not just leading up to some sort of big bang because that becomes a sort of a pass or fail moment and you set too many things in place, but building up a number of things that are part of that picture you're trying to put in place.
What mistakes have you made along the way in the roles that you've had in the past, James?
I think trying to do too much too quickly. I'm an ambitious person. I believe that you can achieve a lot. That ambition can really help sometimes, but sometimes you almost set out stuff that feels too overwhelming for the business. And so I've learned along the way to think about each of your stakeholders and spend far more time taking time to tailor messages to them and to actually make sure that they're on the journey. And I had one bit of feedback when I presented relatively newly into a business that I was bringing them the Ferrari option and all they needed was the Nissan Micra. And it was about me then going back and telling them that, yes, what I've done is created the vision for where we want to go. You're not going to get the Ferrari today. We're going to go through that version and, you will have the Nissan Micra along that journey. But this is not just putting in the Nissan Micra and stopping. But I think to me, it's that lesson of really working and building that stakeholder alliance around a business and understanding where all of those influential relationships can be. And I think as much of what you do, it's how you take people with you. And I think that was one of my big learnings, early on in my career. And I think you constantly make those mistakes. And I haven't made the let's just do the same thing over and over again, because that's not really me. But I've seen so many people make that mistake, and that's the one I would, get people to err away from, is just because it's worked in your last role. Don't assume it's going to work in your new role. Almost be more critical of anything that you've done in a previous role, because your natural inclination is to view that really positively. So you probably have to be your own devil's advocate for some of those things.
Yeah, I think that's the one that I've seen the most, is people copying and pasting and taking, like you said, PowerPoint slides, folders, whatever it was, and putting that into their new job, and it hasn't necessarily worked. So I think it's learning from those things, but not taking everything that you've done. So is there any other advice or guidance you'd give people who are preparing to take on a new role at the moment?
Yeah, I think if you're taking on a role and you've done it before, you will have learned the lessons of what you've done last time. So reflect on those, think back, set yourselves personal goals. Don't always share those with everyone else, but set yourself your own personal goals as to what you want to achieve. Remember, if you're the leader of a team, it's more isolating than if you've been a team member. So build up your network of support. Start to think, when you're walking into a role, who might I need to tap into? Who can sense check these things along the way? Because if you're going in and spending, 90 days reviewing your team and your function and your business, and you're going to present a plan back, who's going to be your devil's advocate? Who's going to sit there and be your mentor, or be able to provide you challenge back? Because it might be that you find you're going into a business and people just want to please you. So you're presenting stuff and they're either saying it's wonderful, or conversely, they're turning around and going, oh my God, that's new and horrible, and just trying to kill it with a shoe, like a bug that's run across a hotel room. So it's where's your balance and where's your support network come from? And also, I think almost that forget you know everything and just get back to that curiosity point. That would be my number one, of just walk in there, be energized, be curious, keep your energy up. And probably the most important thing is, you are in a privileged position when you start a new role of you have an opportunity to find things out about your business. And you get to that point where if you don't do it in the first couple of weeks or in the first couple of months, it almost becomes too late. So I've seen it, say, in the care industry, where people come in and roll through and they go through their functional inductions and they don't really understand how a care home works. And it's like, you almost get to the point that if you haven't done that bit right at the beginning, and you haven't taken the time to go and shadow something or do something where, once you're caught up in the busyness of a job where you've got to deliver and you've got targets, it's very hard to go back and do those things. So sit back and think about those things. So how does my business really operate? Is what I'm being told true? Have I gone out and evidence checked that to see what's happening on the ground? So, for example, how are people innovating and problem solving? How collaborative are we? How good a place is it to work? Those questions, you might get an answer, but you can really actually go and get some real experience of those things at the start of a job. It's so much harder to do those things once you're embedded. So take the time to do all those holistic things as well.
Yeah, I think that's some really good advice, and I think it's taking those things and not taking it negatively, and thinking about the positives that you could potentially make as well in it. That it's work, like you mentioned previously, that it's working like that for a reason. It's not necessarily anyone's fault as such, but you're coming in as a fresh pair of eyes, and that is something that's really positive. So you're not there to necessarily criticize anything that's happened previously. Thank you for joining me today, James. It was really good to hear your kind of advice and your do's and don'ts for people starting a new role. If people want to connect with you and find out a bit more about you, how do they go about doing that?
So yeah, thank you for having me on, Katie. This is something I feel really passionately about, because I think it's a really difficult challenge for people going into a new role, and it can be the make or break of that role for you. It can be the make or break of your career at times, about getting those things right. And there's so many things and bits of advice I'd want to share with people or be able to talk through. So if people want to talk to me about that or anything else, probably the best way is to get hold of me on LinkedIn. So that will be in the show notes below, but it's James Poletyllo. There's only one of me, so it's not particularly hard to find me on LinkedIn. Or again, you can contact us via the website or contact me via the website, and my phone number and email are on there. So please feel free to reach out if you want to talk about this, something else, or, again, I'm happy to be that sounding board for people.
Awesome. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Learning Reinvented podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've not already done so, please follow our podcast. And if the Learning Effect can help you and your organisation, please do get in touch. You can find both James and Katie on LinkedIn, and our contact details are in the show notes below.